Well, boys, the time has come. It's time to summarize our kart. Here's how we're going to break this podcast down. Each group member is going to take turns talking about specific components of the kart and what they did to contribute, as well as, in their own words, explain how they believe the build process went. Keep in mind that photos and videos will be displayed throughout the podcast to help detail our experience.
All right. The group name and the name of our kart is Lilo and Sketch, and there are 8 members of our team. I'm Preston. Here with me I have Devin and Caden. Devin, would you like to tell them about our initial plan for our kart?
So for the initial plan, we wanted to start off with a 4-wheel base, and we would use an old chassis and just make minor improvements to it, like lighten the chassis and extend it a bit so that Preston could have a better time going around the course. And we were planning on doing a no suspension kart in order to save complexity and possibly even a gear shifter. For improvements, we increased the sprocket size and lengthened the chassis as we planned to, but we ended up actually going with the suspension because we would have to change out the mounts and make it more complicated than we thought it would be.
So we cut it in half and we lengthened it by 16 inches in 4 separate areas, 2 on the bottom steel bars and 2 on the top steel bars.
And the main reason why we decided to go with this chassis was, 1, it was cheap, and 2, we knew right off the bat that this chassis would be very strong and it'd be able to handle what we throw at it. On that note, I think we should also talk about some of the hurdles that we faced. So one of the biggest hurdles that our group had to face was the electrical, and the electrical was tough. Due to the limited amount of supplies and resources, the only way that our group was able to build a functional electrical system was to design one ourselves. So this meant that we had to harness components around the classroom and do our best to compile them together in the form of an electrical system. And right here you'll see a picture of our final electrical system, with the exception of a couple of switches that we had to add just to make sure that in the case of emergency, we would be able to safely disarm the system.
And we didn't need to order too much for the electrical, did we?
The only thing that we had to order was the solenoid, because the one that we used before, we found out through a couple of tests that it actually blew up.
Yeah. All right. So for our wheels, we bought some new wheels because we had to order wheels that fit with the 4-way lug that we had on our hubs. And the wheels we ordered were a bit bigger than we expected. We measured it out, but they ended up being a bit wider and a little chunky. And we made the aluminum motor mount smaller in order to help the electrical system fit in better.
All right, Devin, you mentioned that we got new sprocket sizes. What was that ratio on those for the new ones?
It's about a 12 to 80, so we're pushing a little 7 to 1 or 8 to 1.
I think the next one we're going to talk about is the roll cage, which that was probably the most extensive part of this because we had to start with a rough CAD model that I designed myself, which we mostly stuck with, but we had some troubles with making sure everything fit together because CAD model didn't exactly work with physics.
Yep, the real world, whenever you try and build a part, it will never actually turn out exactly how the CAD model says. And that's kind of one of the bigger things that we had to realize going into this kart, that what we designed wouldn't necessarily be 100% of what actually comes out. And especially us being high schoolers, that's kind of how we roll. So a lot of the components ended up being more an eye for eye alignment versus within the millimeters that we put in the CAD model.
And the more complex it gets, the more room there is for those defects too.
Yep.
So once we had our CAD model done, we wanted to make the physical copy of the roll cage. We started off by purchasing 4 12-foot aluminum rods, and then we cut the first 2 sections that we wanted, which were the main support bars that kept the shape together from back to front, and we bent the first 2 of those, which basically had no issues. That was me and Abdullah worked on that. We did pretty good on that. Then we started to have issues when we started to bend our side bars, as one of them was almost perfect and the other one was bent a little bit too much, so we had to find a way to unbend it and not completely collapse its structural stability.
Considering the resources that we had in the class, I'd say that we made the most of a roll cage and did our best in creating one that was not only functional but also aesthetically pleasing. And currently we are welding it. On that note, we should probably talk a little bit about the welding process. Jax in our group did most of the welding. He actually started from barely any skill and worked his way up to becoming the group's full-time welder. The main thing that we had to worry about with the welding was that there was no gaps between the roll cage and its bars that would connect together. If there was gaps, it'd make the welding a little bit difficult. We found that a couple of the parts we did our test welds, we had to redo because the gap was too big. And hopefully within the next day or two, the rest of the roll cage should be welded and we can go ahead and put that on to start the testing. And we do have a couple test videos, as you can see. The cart did pretty well. Braking worked. Devin put together the braking for us. And it actually had quite a bit of power considering how big our wheels were. And I think we have some potential going in this competition.
High hopes.
And despite having 3 separate teams and carts, everyone was always willing to help. It was just a unique environment that allowed us to take advantage of every opportunity that we had. And I know for one, I didn't just work on our cart, I helped the other groups work. I know Wyatt helped with the programming.
Yeah, I just had one question for you, Caden. I know you worked with the electrical and all that. For the safety measures with the sensors and the emergency switches, how did that end up going?
The sensors, it took a little bit to figure out, especially because I'm new to the Arduino coding. But just the wiring and how electrical systems work in general. There was a lot of self-discovery that was involved with it. But in terms of the functionality of our sensors, pretty good. I did a couple tests, and I wanted to make sure that our sensors not only displayed how far away an object was. Depending on how much time we have, we may or may not use 1 or 2 sensors or a couple extra. But I know for a fact that I got 1 sensor to work, 1 sensor to read how far away something was, as well as when something gets a little too close, it would blink. I think that will be a big help in terms of the parking challenge involved in the competition.
And is there a way to adjust when it starts blinking because there is?
Yes, there is. Yeah, once you have the code down and the layout, you can tweak different values, and that will
so we can set it
change
up
the output
to the value that we need to stop at.
You can also change it into different forms of measurement. You can use meters, millimeters, centimeters, inches, feet, whatever you tune it towards.
All right. And then I think really the last thing that we're going to touch on is, Devin, I know you shared the initial plan. How does that compare to what finally happened with the car? I know we had a lot of mishaps with it, so I just wanted to see how did it side by side? How does it work?
So going through the year, it definitely changed a lot. We ended up staying with the 4-wheel base just to keep it simple, and keep the braking situation up to code. And to keep the full suspension, it would just, like I mentioned earlier, keep it less complex. It made it shorter with the taller roll cage, and we did not end up making the gear shifter. It ended up being too complicated, and we didn't want to spend the time on it.
All right, and I think that's all for our group and this podcast. Thank you so much for your time. We can't wait to get to drive it on the test day. I guess we'll see you guys all there.